The story of the PKK is deeply intertwined and inseparable from the narrative of modern Turkey. It's a relationship forged in conflict, shaped by political aspirations, and etched into the very landscape of the nation. To understand Turkey today, one must understand the complex history of the PKK. It's a conflict that ignited in 1984, a spark that quickly grew into a raging fire. And for over 40 years, this conflict has profoundly shaped the nation, influencing its politics, its society, and its international relations. It's a history etched in blood and sacrifice, a constant presence in the Turkish consciousness. What began as a fight for an independent Kurdish state, a dream of self-determination in a region with a long history of marginalization, soon evolved into demands for cultural and political autonomy within Turkey. The focus shifted from complete separation to seeking recognition and rights within the existing framework of the Turkish state. The violence, however, has claimed more than 40,000 lives, a staggering toll that represents not just numbers, but shattered families and lost futures. It's a conflict leaving deep scars on both Kurds and Turks, wounds that may never fully heal. The pain is palpable, the memories raw. The PKK is labeled a terrorist group by Turkey, viewed as an existential threat to the nation's security and stability. This designation is shared by the US and the EU, further isolating the group on the international stage. This fuels a relentless cycle of military crackdowns and reprisals, a seemingly endless loop of violence and retribution. For many Turks, the PKK threatens national unity, representing a dangerous challenge to the country's territorial integrity. But for many Kurds, it symbolizes resistance against decades of state repression, a fight for their very identity and survival. This deep divide makes peace elusive, a distant dream that seems to slip further away with each passing year. Every step forward is weighed down by history and emotion, by generations of mistrust and animosity. In July 2025, the PKK's announcement of disarmament, a declaration that reverberated around the world, signaled a possible end to armed struggle, a potential turning point in this long and bloody conflict. It was a moment that forced the nation to imagine a different future, a future free from violence and filled with the promise of reconciliation. The prospect of fighters laying down arms, once unthinkable given the decades of entrenched conflict, became real, a tangible step towards a more peaceful future. Is this the final chapter, the long-awaited conclusion to this tragic story? Or is it just another turn in a long, painful story, a temporary respite in a cycle of violence that seems destined to repeat itself? Only time will tell. The turning point, the moment that shifted the tectonic plates of the conflict, came not through hushed secret talks behind closed doors or through traditional diplomatic channels. It wasn't the result of backroom deals or quiet concessions. Instead, it arrived in the form of a video message, a broadcast that would reverberate across the nation and beyond. In July 2025, PKK commander Semil Bayik, a figure synonymous with the organization's long history of armed struggle, stepped before the camera. He delivered an announcement that few had dared to imagine: the group's disarmament. A seismic shift in the landscape of the conflict. Bayik declared the withdrawal of PKK fighters from Turkish soil, a move that signaled a potential end to decades of armed conflict. He carefully framed it not as a surrender, not as a sign of weakness, but as a deliberate step toward a lasting political solution, a new chapter in the struggle for Kurdish rights. The PKK strategically positioned itself as responding to the growing chorus of Kurdish and international calls for peace, acknowledging the global desire for a resolution to this long-standing conflict. The stated aim was to shift the focus, to transition away from armed struggle, from the battlefield, and towards the arena of political engagement, seeking to achieve their goals through dialogue and negotiation. Yet the announcement came with a series of significant demands, conditions that would test the willingness of the Turkish government to reciprocate. Turkey, Bayik insisted, must immediately halt all military operations in the region. Furthermore, the PKK demanded the release of thousands of Kurdish political prisoners, individuals they considered unjustly detained. This was far from a simple ceasefire agreement, a mere cessation of hostilities. It was in reality an opening move, a calculated gambit in what promised to be a high-stakes negotiation, a complex dance of diplomacy and power. The PKK's very identity, for so long inextricably tied to its armed wing and its history of guerrilla warfare, now faced the prospect of a dramatic transformation, a fundamental shift in its purpose and methods. The question loomed large. Could the PKK successfully transition and evolve into a legitimate political force capable of operating within the democratic framework? And, crucially, would the Turkish state be willing to engage in good faith? Or would it view this announcement as a sign of victory, an opportunity to consolidate its power? The answers to these critical questions remained shrouded in uncertainty, hanging in the balance. Everything hinged on the fragile process that had just begun, a delicate dance with the potential for both peace and renewed conflict. The nation, weary of decades of violence and instability, held its breath, anxiously waiting to see if this historic announcement heralded a genuine era of lasting peace, or if it was merely a temporary pause, a deceptive calm before the storm. Ankara's response to the PKK's declaration of a ceasefire was a complex tapestry, weaving together threads of cautious hope with the unyielding steel of national security concerns. The initial reaction from Turkish officials was carefully calibrated, reflecting a deep-seated wariness born from decades of conflict. President Erdogan, in his first public address following the announcement, acknowledged the PKK's move, calling it a potentially historic chance for peace, a window of opportunity that could lead to a lasting resolution of the Kurdish issue. However, he insisted that this opportunity hinged on total, irreversible disarmament of the PKK forces. This was not merely a suggestion, but a firm prerequisite for any further dialogue or negotiation. There would be no half measures, no ambiguity in the disarmament process. The government demanded complete transparency and verifiable steps to ensure the PKK's commitment to ending its armed struggle. In the meantime, Turkish security operations would continue unabated across the region. The military maintained its presence, conducting patrols and reinforcing security measures in areas where PKK activity had been prevalent. These operations would only cease when every PKK fighter had either demonstrably disarmed or left the country, effectively dismantling the organization's capacity for armed resistance. The government therefore refused to halt its ongoing military campaign, viewing it as a necessary measure to maintain pressure on the PKK and ensure compliance with its demands. Furthermore, Ankara made it clear that it would not negotiate on matters of security until the PKK provided concrete evidence of its commitment to disarmament and peaceful resolution. Erdogan also issued a stern warning against any attempts to use the peace process for political leverage or to advance agendas unrelated to genuine disarmament and reconciliation. This was widely interpreted as a signal of caution toward Kurdish political parties and activists, particularly those who might seek to exploit the situation to gain political advantage. The state's message was clear: peace is indeed possible, a desirable outcome for all parties involved. But this peace could only be achieved on its terms, under conditions that safeguarded Turkey's national security and territorial integrity. Ankara's firm stance reinforced its authority, demonstrating its unwavering commitment to protecting its citizens and maintaining order within its borders. The government was making it unequivocally clear that sovereignty and security were non-negotiable principles, the bedrock upon which any lasting peace agreement must be built. The door to peace was open, ajar with the possibility of a new chapter in Turkish-Kurdish relations. However, access to that peace was contingent upon the PKK meeting every single condition laid out by the Turkish government, leaving no room for compromise or deviation. The delicate balance between cautious hope and deep-seated skepticism, between the promise of peace and the realities of ongoing conflict, defined this pivotal moment in Turkish history. The world reacted swiftly to the PKK's disarmament. The US and EU welcomed the move, urging both sides to seize the chance for lasting peace. The UN called for trust-building and protection of civilians, recognizing the fragility of the process. But Turkey's neighbors were wary. Iraq feared instability as PKK fighters might cross its borders, while Iran worried about unrest among its own Kurdish population. For the region, the PKK's disarmament was not just Turkey's affair. It was a potential trigger for new challenges. The international spotlight intensified, but so did regional anxieties. For Kurdish activists, disarmament was just the beginning. They demanded constitutional reform to recognize Kurdish identity and guarantee equal citizenship. Language rights were central: full freedom to use and teach Kurdish and official recognition in public life. The release of thousands of Kurdish political prisoners was seen as essential for trust and reconciliation. These demands went far beyond ending violence. They aimed to address the roots of the conflict. The Kurdish question now stood before the Turkish state, stripped of the shadow of armed struggle. Would Ankara respond with reform or maintain the status quo? The next phase would test the government's willingness to confront history. Decades of violence have bred deep mistrust on both sides. The Turkish state fears the PKK's disarmament is a tactical move. Kurds worry the state will renege on reforms once the threat is gone. This mutual suspicion makes bold steps risky and rare. Ankara's focus remains on security, not political concessions, leaving many Kurds skeptical. Without a clear roadmap for rights and representation, the peace process risks stalling. The real challenge is breaking the cycle of distrust and addressing the core Kurdish demands. Disarmament ends the violence, but not the underlying conflict. Only courage and compromise can turn this fragile moment into lasting peace. The PKK's disarmament marks a turning point, but the dawn is fragile. The image of fighters leaving the mountains offers hope, yet the weight of history lingers. True peace requires more than laying down arms. It demands political dialogue and real reform. Will Turkey recognize Kurdish rights and build an inclusive democracy? Can Kurds shift from armed resistance to peaceful politics? The answers will shape the nation's future. This is not the end, but the start of a new chapter, one of reconciliation and shared citizenship. The journey will be long and uncertain, but the chance for peace is real. The world watches, hoping this fragile dawn will finally bring the peace so long sought.